One of the most disturbing elements of the Prohibition war is how it's made police the enemy of otherwise law-abiding cannabis consumers. Fortunately, one group of police officers knows the futility of Prohibition and reaches out to educate the community and current law enforcement. Today, the Russ Belville Show visits with another speaker from Law Enforcement Against Prohibition with one clear message: cops say legalize drugs.
Welcome back, everybody. 34 after the hour, and joining us right now is one of my favorite people in the whole world on the board of LEAP, the Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. We have Diane Goldstein. Diane, welcome back.
Hey, Russ. Thank you so much for having me here.
You know, we're doing a special series of shows this week where we're focusing on the impact of Child Protective Services and the drug war on families and mothers in particular. And I just wanted to open up with that and give you the opportunity to give us some of your experience on how you've seen this drug war affect families.
Well, you know, you have to really start with the purpose of having Child Protective Services was never to rip apart families. What it was to provide wraparound services and resources to keep families together. And taking children out of a family's home was the last thing that you would do, in the sense of there had to be some tremendous dangers. So when I worked detectives, when I was working in law enforcement, whether it was patrol or as a supervisor, the assessment was, what can we do to keep the family together, number one, and number two is how severe was the issue, the problem that needed to be corrected. And so you would really have to have someone who's molested or beaten or something really significant, and the war on drugs has changed that. Simply that if you have, you know, let's start talking about medical marijuana as the classic example, is even though you're a patient, you're responsibly using it, we're going to take your children because it's against the federal law. And I think that's what needs to be changed.
And this is a story that we've heard over and over again. There's the Daisy Bram story there in California, Baby Bree in Michigan. We've got stories from all of these medical marijuana states where the mere use of medical marijuana, or in some cases the growing of a plant, is considered enough to be called child endangerment. And yet on yesterday's show we spoke to...
Yeah, and that's not what child endangerment was about.
Right, exactly. And we spoke to Lisa Calvin, a teacher who had taught in Iowa, and spoke of her experiences reporting actual abuse, you know, seeing bruised kids in school who then Child Protective Services never did intervene, saying there wasn't enough to make the case, and then destroying that trust between the teacher and the child. How did this get so perverted in that actual cases of abuse are being ignored by Child Protective Services in favor of medical marijuana patients?
You know what? I think a lot of it has been driven by political ideology and rhetoric, quite frankly. And then I think no different than those underlying circumstances that surround policing for profit. There's also those underlying circumstances that surround adoption for profit. And it's, if you start looking at kind of some of the federal drug laws, they started to incentivize, whether it was CPS or law enforcement, for, you know, either arresting more drug offenders or taking children out of folks' homes who allegedly were drug addicts or used or abused drugs, because there is an incentive motive for CPS. They are getting, and I'm not certain what the latest federal amount of money, but I think at one point they were getting like $8,000 for every successful adoption and termination of family rights.
Wow. This is, you know, it seems like every direction we look here, there's been a profit motive attached to it. We, of course, have talked many times about the burn justice grants that incentivize cops to go after pot smokers over real criminals. We've got the CPS now with adoption incentives to break up those families once the pot criminals are taken and put them with other families. And then we've got the prisons for profit where we can take the pot criminals and house them away. What are we going to do, Diane, to change this profit motivation in any of those those areas?
Well, I think that probably one of the first places that we have to start is by really engaging our activist community to become much more sophisticated and much more politically astute. And they have to start taking responsibility for, in some aspects, maybe it's creating a marijuana lobbying organization that contributes money to PACs that backs candidates that are pro-drug reform laws. And it doesn't have to be a partisan issue. I mean, you can start looking at whether it's, the Gary Johnsons of the world or some other politicians that are finally starting to call for the end to the war on drugs. I think that's going to be incredibly helpful. And then I think what is also successful is working with organizations like, the ACLU or the Drug Policy Alliance or other local coalitions where you can start bringing in personal experiences and stories. I was just in New Mexico over Veterans Day weekend where I did an advocacy panel, or I wouldn't even call it a panel. I facilitated the whole entire day for the Drug Policy Alliance to encourage veterans to organize and then work with collaborative partners to get in front of legislators and tell their personal stories. There's nothing like an articulate mother, whether it's Bree's parents or Daisy Bram or someone else's, who gets in there and talks about the things that happened to them when their family was torn apart. The economic loss, the damage emotionally to children. You start getting psychologists who work with kids that talk about the damage. You start, in addition to bringing in faces like Law Enforcement Against Prohibition or other social justice organizations that show the impact of removing a child out of that loving environment really early on. And let's just use classic examples, like the 3-year-old girl in Texas that was killed after her parents were caught smoking pot, even though it wasn't a danger to the child. The child didn't even know. I mean, those are the things that we need to address, and those personal stories makes it really hard for politicians to turn their backs on us, Russ.
Yes, and, we've also spoken many times about the gross racial disparity in the drug war with respect to arrests and incarceration and sentencing and so forth. Did you see in your experience a racial disparity with how these Child Protective Services cases were handled?
No, interesting enough. Well, and I think it's also it's different demographically. Where I was at is children were taken out of folks' home, and for the most part, it was done in a fashion that it really didn't revolve around the drug issue. But then it's changed radically in the last 10 years, which is when I've been out of law enforcement. I retired in 2004. It's almost 2014. And it's really been those last 10 years where it's changed dramatically. In California, with respect to medical marijuana, it's been a lot of families that are kind of maybe living off the grid. They're white. They're not necessarily, they're not urban. But it's different when you go to another city, so it really depends. But the classic example is even with drug use, when I was working, it was about the behavior. Because whether you're abusing prescription drugs or alcohol or, some other type of substance, there had been a distinctive behavior that caused your child to get taken away from you. Probably the classic example that I have is we had a child that was a failure to thrive baby, but the child wasn't being fed. It was filthy, the home, there was cockroaches. There was a distinctive and important reason to take this child away from this family because it would have died from malnutrition.
Okay, we're speaking with Diane Goldstein from the Board of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. You can find out more about LEAP at leap.cc. And it is Child Protective Services Week here. We're kind of focusing on family law and how that interfaces with marijuana users, marijuana patients. And Diane, I've heard reports from some folks about how, even people that were activists and had some idea of how criminal law worked by, reading case after case after case, that were shocked once they realized that family law is not subject to a lot of the same restrictions as cops are. Can you give us any insight on that?
Sure. There's a much lower standard because you're not working within a criminal conviction. So all you need is almost like a probable cause, and that's all the judge needs or the social worker needs to take that child out of the home. Now, there is a system set up in place where what happens normally when you have children that are taken away out of a family. So now you have attorneys that represent the parent. You have to have attorneys that represent the child independently of the parent. And then you have the social worker who has attorneys representing the county's interest. And then you have a judge. And it can be incredibly complicated. And one of the issues relative to it is what you have to also start looking at when you start looking at these drug issues is the coercive drug rehabilitation that's demanded, the coercive drug testing that people have to pass. And so there's all sorts of impediments that allows for failure. And instead of, working with families to address were there any issues, or even to understand that, this parent is a medical marijuana patient, has never abused the child. This child in the system is going to take resources away from so many other kids. I mean, down here in LA County, Los Angeles County Child Protective Services, I can't begin to tell you the scandal surrounding dozens of kids that have been beaten to death. And so here's kids that should be in the system that aren't. And then you're taking all this time to go after someone who's a medical marijuana patient. It just, to me, it's no different than that, argument Leap always makes is right now we have 400,000 untested rape kits across America several months ago based on a special by Anderson Cooper. And the reason for it is because we continue to focus on drug war stats and drug offenders instead of going after violent criminals.
Yes, it's something we've discussed before, and it's just another one of those insane, perverse incentives of the drug war. Diane, we have to take a break for some advertising, but would you be willing to stay with us here, maybe do another 10 minutes at the other side of this? We'll wrap this segment up.
Absolutely.
Sounds good to me. We'll take a quick little break here. You're listening to the Russ Belville Show here on 420radio.org. Our guest is Diane Goldstein. She's one of the board of directors from Law Enforcement Against Prohibition and a tireless activist who is following me all over the country. We'll be right back.
I am.
Stick around.
We'll be right back after these messages from our 420 friendly sponsors. Support these advertisers because their ad money goes straight to the Russ Belville Show. You're tuned into the Russ Belville Show, the voice of the marijuana nation.
Ever wonder how often to change your bong water? The most effective method for baking pot brownies? The best destinations for a ganja getaway? How to hide herb in your car? Whether to grow your own? How precisely to legalize it? Or how something as wonderful as marijuana ever got to be illegal in the first place? Finally, you can find all these answers and much more in the official High Times Pot Smoker's Handbook, featuring 420 things to do when you're stoned. Since 1974, High Times magazine has covered marijuana in all its aspects and wonders, from cultivation to legalization to the herb's enduring and exalted place in popular culture. Packed with inside information, the official High Times Pot Smoker's Handbook rolls all of this collected wisdom together into a single indispensable ganja guide, including an entertaining look at marijuana's history, profiles of herb-friendly travel destinations and festivals, favorite potluck recipes from the High Times staff, smoking skills, advocacy and activism, essential marijuana movies and songs, profiles of famous cannabis strains, comprehensive growing information, celebrity endorsements, and much more.
Statistics show that 40% of all kids who smoke marijuana live in the city. Guess where the other 60% live?
Legalize it. Don't criticize.
I'm just overjoyed. I've been cannabis activist for 40 years.
We're turning the corner on a failed policy that's been disastrous for our communities, and things are going to get better.
80 years ago, we repealed alcohol prohibition in this state. We did it prior to the federal government, and we're doing the same thing when it comes to marijuana. We are a step ahead, and we will continue to lead the way. It means I'm going to smoke a lot of weed tonight. Woo!
Some call it marijuana.
You're listening to Radical Russ on the Russ Belville Show.
Some of them call it ganja.
Welcome back, everybody. Indeed, we did legalize it in Washington State and in Colorado, and even that is still causing problems for families. Welcome back. We are in the middle of CPS week here on the Russ Belville Show, and that's right. Even in Washington and Colorado, where it is legal to possess and use marijuana, parents can still face discrimination. They can still face the loss of their children and the interface with Child Protective Services. We've got Diane Goldstein, a board member from Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, on the line. Diane, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Russ. Much appreciate being on.
Hey, I'd like to get into that subject a little bit, this idea about legalization in Washington and Colorado. We just saw a poll that came out that people said by about a 2-to-1 margin that people shouldn't lose their jobs if they're smoking pot in a legal state. I would think that people's opinions with regard to losing your kids when you're smoking pot in a legal state would probably be even a bigger majority, but they do still face some danger there, don't they?
Yeah, they do. And, you know, I think part of that issue is the ongoing stigma that's associated with cannabis users. And I think that's the place where, you know, it's so difficult sometimes is to get people to come out of the closet. If every cannabis consumer came out of the closet publicly and, you know, demanded that the war on cannabis be ended, it'd be ended in just a hot second. But it's very difficult for people to shed that stigma that's been associated with being an illicit black market drug user. And until people, you know, let go of that, and until our politicians, until law enforcement does it, it's going to be very difficult. So, you know, this whole greater issue of legalization across the states and the acceptance of medical marijuana or full legal recreational, I think is significant because that's going to change the face of how we deal with our children and our families. And I think that, you know, LEAP says it, and I've said it for a long time, is we have to start recognizing and treating, you know, drugs differently. Is the first step, and although it's an incremental step to ending the war on drugs, is in fact legalizing marijuana. And as more states tip and turn that way, we'll have less of these abuses. But I think right now you're seeing kind of the last dying groan of dinosaurs across our federal government and across our law enforcement leaders. So they're hanging on to their power. And what's happening is they're abusing their power significantly. And like anything else is when you have bad laws, bad things happen. And the more we can show the impact of the breeze or that tragic, horrible circumstance where that little girl got killed because of a foster parent, or things like the unconstitutional body cavity searches out of Deming, New Mexico, or, you know, Texas roadside body cavity searches on females. The more we shine the light, I think that the more change we can affect.
I agree with that, and I've seen a lot of that happening over the past 2 or 3 years with the stiletto stoners phenomenon and Moms for Marijuana and more of these high-profile women coming out and admitting that they are cannabis consumers. But we get a good question here from our chat room. Lively Libra wants to know, how do you do that without fearing arrest when you're in a non-legal state, a non-medical state like Iowa or Texas or Florida? It's a little different than, there's some parallels with the gay and lesbian movement, you know, coming out of the closet, but you couldn't get arrested for being gay, although you could lose your job. How does one do that how would you do that in a non-legal state?
You know, I think that the strongest and the best way to do it is by getting in contact with a local drug policy reform organization. And the ones I always recommend are like Drug Policy Alliance or the ACLU that have some real significant legal beagles behind them and work through the back door to start sharing your story or your family's story with legislators and with people in power. But the other thing is simply coming out to your family and friends is a big part of it. Think about that. There's a lot of people who are very open about their being a cannabis consumer or being a patient, even if it's in a non-medical state, but they won't share that with people that they love because they feel that the people that they love will judge them. And so that's no different than the LGBT movement. Is we have to start by influencing those closest to us, who then can carry that torch of advocacy for us as well. But it is scary because, quite frankly, different than, coming out of the closet in today's day and age. I mean, they used to arrest people that were gay and homosexual. They no longer are. But sometimes it's just starting off with those you love and then working your way into some more of a public advocacy type work. And that's the hard part because you are going to be a target. I really believe that I'm a target in California law enforcement now because of my very, very strident voice against people like, the California narcotics officers and the California chiefs. So I'm really careful about if I have a glass of wine, my husband drives or my son drives, I understand that fear and having to protect yourself personally.
I just got back from visiting my folks in Idaho, and I always imagine at the Idaho State Police, there is a nice headshot of me with maybe a bounty in, I don't know what they what they put on my head there, but I understand where you're coming from, Diane. You mentioned coming out and being open with your family and friends, and in one situation that happens, we have married couples who are using cannabis. Maybe one or both of them are using cannabis, but then they end up getting a divorce, and one spouse will use that against the other spouse. What have you ever heard of? Is there any possibility someone could, and maybe this is more a question for a lawyer, but something to the effect of a prenup where parents could agree they wouldn't use that against each other? I mean, that's an interesting side of this, don't you think?
You know what? And that's the, people being people. I used to get that a lot when I was working child abuse, where people would basically accuse the other spouse of either physical abuse, being drug addicts, or sexually molesting their children. And so, that's that whole ethical, moral, how do you get people to do the right thing and not to lash out against those that they used to love? I just find it appalling because it's one of those things that, you were with this person enough that you had their child, and now you're out to destroy them. It's different if that person is truly a bad actor and is endangering that child. But yeah, that'd be, you could always do it in a prenup, but it would depend on how the courts would look at it.
Yeah. Yeah. I would think it being, if, an illegal substance in some states, you couldn't really make a contract regarding an illegal substance. I don't know. We'll have to ask the lawyers.
Yeah. But it's a tough situation, and who suffers most in those types of situations? The children. Just like when CPS comes in and takes a child out of that loving environment.
Another aspect of this to talk about, of course, we focus primarily on marijuana on this show, but Law Enforcement Against Prohibition is for the legalization of all drugs. And while it might be easy to talk to the general public and say, we shouldn't take away a kid if someone's smoking pot, I think it might be a harder argument to make if they're smoking meth or snorting lines of coke. To what level should someone's drug use be a per se indicator of bad parenthood?
I think is when, and this is the real difficulty because it's very, very subjective, because you could go into someone's family and that mother, if she has one drink, turns abusive. So I think just like when we talk about it from the LEAP perspective, you have to separate the behavior away from simply the use of that drug. We have a tremendous amount of laws on the books already that today, if all drugs were legal today and we walked into a house and you had someone who was on heroin-assisted program, let's say some type of pharmaceutical model, and they beat their child because of being under the influence, it's the behavior that you have to focus on. And I think that's the thing that we have to continue to do. And then we have to give families who are struggling with addiction, no matter if it's prescription drugs or something else, the resources in order to get effective treatment and become better parents.
Absolutely. Diane Goldstein with the Board of Directors of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, and also a former Lieutenant Commander, Redondo Beach Police Department. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us your expertise, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Russ. Always a pleasure.
All right, folks, that's all the time for Hour 1, but come on Hour 2, we've got Mark Reinhart from Idaho Calling with a deep look at the financial incentives in Child Protective Services. For everyone here at the Russ Belville Show, I'm Radical Russ, and until next time, take care of each other, tokers.
This is the Russ Belville Show. The Russ Belville Show is blogging and podcasting daily at radicalruss.com.
Take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it. You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it. You take a seed, you plant it,